Hey folks, this is a presentation to introduce the chapter and interview with Dr. James Banks, focused on his five dimensions of multicultural education and the characteristics and goals of multicultural education. As I noted, Dr. Banks, he was a professor at the University of Washington for many decades. He recently retired, I think, last year. And if you're interested to learn more about him or see some of his other articles that have been published, this is a link to his website at the University of Washington. And it has some articles about that he has written. In the beginning of the chapter, I believe, the beginning of the chapter, he talks about sort of how multicultural education got its start. And he also talks about how it's important to remember how the United States is a super diverse, culturally diverse country, really from the very origins of our country. And so he talks about how there's sort of macrocultural norms that have been put in place, generally speaking, and reinforced by people in power, Anglo-European, white identifying men, generally speaking, from the back in the day. The 4 main sort of cultural norms that he explores and discusses briefly are equality, individual opportunity, that idea that, if you try hard enough, you can succeed anything you want in America, quote unquote America, and that's a really important part of like the American dream and our cultural norms here. Individualism versus groupism. Individualism tends to be more of the macrocultural norm in the United States, and expansionism and manifest destiny. The idea that human beings, and particularly human beings in the United States, have a sort of right to control the environment, to expand their control over property, as well as control over cultural norms, language, things like that. On the other side of the slide here, I just made note of some of the nonverbal communication modes that also have macrocultural norms to them. So, for example, haptics is how we describe how we use touch and gesture while we interact. And the macrocultural norms around that would be probably less touching and less gestures. So I won't go through all of these for time's sake, but just some other things to consider with regards to nonverbal ways that we communicate our cultural background, our cultural norms, etc. The other thing that I wanted to briefly introduce, which I bet you've seen before, but to remind you, and maybe some things to think about as you're thinking about your own cultural lenses and experiences, is the whole cultural iceberg model. And the main idea behind this model is that our core values are things that oftentimes we don't necessarily reflect on, but are taken as assumptions, and then those result in behaviors that are observable. So sometimes when we don't understand a behavior of someone else, it may be due to cultural differences. Another thing that Banks touches on, but I think is super important and may not be emphasized enough in this particular introductory chapter, is the notion of intersectionality and cultural hybridity. And basically, this is just the idea that, although I may belong to a specific ethnic group or social class group or gender group, all of those different factors are going to intersect and interact and have an effect on my individual behavior, my beliefs, my practices. So there's just as much diversity within a specific cultural group as there is between cultural groups. So there are many, many aspects of our identity that influence how we interpret, identify with, see, and express our own cultural identity. And the 5 dimensions of a multicultural education that Banks discusses, particularly in the interview, he goes into it a little bit more clearly and provides examples. And those are content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice reduction, equity pedagogy, and empowering school culture. And so I will be kind of brief on this. I do provide a few examples for each one, but I'm going to kind of try to keep it short. So content integration, Banks discusses how that's sort of what everybody thinks about when they think about multicultural education, and basically means including content about specific groups of people that typically are left out of our curriculum. So that initially led to sort of single group studies, ethnic studies, stuff like that. Knowledge construction relates to how knowledge is produced, whose points of view have the most value, whose point of view is represented. And he talks about how important it is for us to use a diversity of perspectives, diversity of authors in our classrooms. Prejudice reduction is also another important dimension of multicultural education, and is something that we can all work towards. Even very young children are aware of gender expectations, racial differences, things like that. There's a pretty interesting video that was made about, now it's like 10, 12 years ago, called A Girl Like Me, where a young African-American woman interviewed some of her friends and reenacted this famous experiment that Kenneth Clark did, where he gave young Black children different dolls and asked them which ones that they wanted to play with, and they oftentimes chose the white dolls. And she also found the same thing in her reenactment of that little experiment too. So that's a short video if you feel like watching it. And not last, but close to last, equity pedagogy means learning about and integrating different pedagogical techniques while we are teaching in order that a wider variety of students can participate, interact, learn. We want to focus on inquiry-based learning, cooperative learning, using different types of learning structures, and definitely learning about and using students' interests and background knowledge in our classrooms. And finally, empowering school culture. This dimension relates to the school culture as a whole. What are the norms, values of the school culture? Who gets to participate in developing those norms? Whose voice is being heard? Things like that. And that is all that I have for you. I think my last slide here, which is not wanting to load. Here it is. My last slide, this is not included in the reading, but in other of his publications, Banks talked about how we can have different levels of the extent to which that we are integrating those different dimensions of multicultural education. We might start out with this contributions approach of, hey, it's Black History Month. We're gonna have some events around that. We're gonna have, our books highlighted in our library, what have you. But the goal overall is really more transforming the curriculum and being able to help our students ourselves and our students make decisions and take action and, like we said at the beginning, participate in our democracy. So that's it. Little bit longer than I wanted, as per usual, but I hope that is useful if you are one that likes the auditory overview. All right, I look forward to chatting with you in our discussion forums this week. Ciao.